Welcome to the Radical Rhythm Podcast. This has been created for those of us that love radical women who live perhaps by the rules, but also question and challenge the status quo. We want more from our lives, to enjoy our sexuality, to explore radical thought, and to celebrate women who have lived and continue to live unconventional lives. Hi, I'm Dr. Toni Bear, sexologist, educator, activist, and definitely a radical woman. Thank you for joining me as I share stories of women challenging the status quo and living life to the fullest. Join me as we unapologetically march to the beat of a different drummer together. Welcome to the Radical Rhythm Podcast, episode number 4. I am Dr. Toni Bear, and I am absolutely thrilled that you are watching or listening to this podcast. This idea for this podcast came from a study that I read in 2019 from the National Geographic Society. They reported that 29% of Americans reported themselves as defining themselves as feminist. And 69% of Americans said no, they're not feminists. Less than 2% of the survey actually didn't identify one way or another. So it got me to thinking in 2019, where in the world are the feminists? Is this a dying idea? Is everything equal now? And now we don't need feminism? What happened? Right? So, 2020 was coming up, which was the anniversary of women's suffrage, both in the United States and in the UK. So I wrote a grant and I formed a team of 3 college students and myself, and we sought to interview 15 Americans and 15 Brits about their feminist experiences, their feminist ideas, and gain some insights to at least, well, it was 15 and 15, it was actually 30 people altogether. 30 individuals' insights into why they still call themselves a feminist. And is feminism alive and well? So this team of 3 college students and myself sat down and we just came up with 5 general questions. What is feminism to you? What does a feminist look like? What kind of experiences have you had that you would consider feminist? Is there a 4th wave of feminism? And what do you see the future of feminism looking like? Those were the questions. And they were broad so that we could engage these self-identified women with these questions, that the conversations could go in any direction. We wanted to find out, is there a difference between the way United States feminists feel and British feminists? And then we also divided them up into 5 second wave feminists, 5 third wave feminists, 5 fourth wave feminists from the United States, and the same from the UK. So we wanted to see if there was an intergenerational difference and also a cross-cultural comparison. Now, you might be thinking, well, there's only 30 people in this study. Well, surveys were done with large numbers. What we were trying to do is try to drill down and are there radical women left in the world? That's what we're looking at. And what kind of insights can we get from the individuals that we studied? And let me share the results with you. The answers basically came in 5 themes. The first theme was, what is feminism? What is feminism to them? And we found a difference, not between countries, but between generations. Those that were of the second wave. Now, if you want some kind of reference as to what we're talking about age wise, first wave feminists are suffragettes, and they're no longer on this earth. Second wave feminists would be currently in their 60s and 70s, 80s, and they would have been part of the marches and the protests in the 1960s and 70s. Okay? So the second wave feminists reported, no matter if they were in Britain or the United States, that they defined feminism to be activism, time in the streets, protests. And there are different kinds of protests and different ways that both United States feminists and British feminists protested. However, activism was at the core of how second wave feminists define themselves as feminists back in the day and still today. Now, third wave feminists are those that are from their 30s to about 60, and they were active in the 80s and 90s and the turn of the century into the 21st century. And what was very interesting is that they had no clear definition of what feminism was. It was something different to each one of them. And we couldn't pull a theme from what they said. However, fourth wave feminists, our youngest members of our study, those that are under 30, many of which were in college, they were very firm. They said feminism is equality of all genders. Very different than the definition of second wave feminists, that it was activism in the streets for women's rights and those who define themselves as a woman. So feminism is different in this fourth wave. And if folks are defining themselves in this day and age as a feminist, if you believe in the advocacy of all gender identifications, if that's the definition, then perhaps that's why there aren't as many feminists or self identified feminists or radical women in this world today. What we found out through conversations after that point are that, some of the second wave feminists have no idea when we talk about a spectrum of genders. So we found that very interesting. 3 main topics were themes that came out. One was the topic of gender roles, the role that somebody plays as defined by their gender. And we found that there was both millennials, those were 30s to 50s who are in the workforce right now. They were more likely than any other group to report discrimination in the workplace. Or discrimination at home in the gender roles that are expected in their marriages. Specifically, the difference in gender roles, the second wave feminists talked about women's groups and how important it was to educate all of society about equality. Third wave feminists talked about their most important activism is actually in raising their children and their children to believe in equality of all gender. Fourth wave feminists, our youngest in the group, were brought up in those households by third wave feminists, and they said they were brought up with the ideals of equality, and they believe that feminism today is the fight for intersectionalism, not just gender identities, but racial justice as well. Those that identified as persons of color, both in the United States and Britain, talked about growing up in households today in 2021, right? This was done in 2020, that are gendered. Their roles at home are gendered, and that they have inequalities in the household. and they were more likely than those that define themselves as Caucasian to be in a household that limited their roles and assigned them by gender. Our second theme that came through was about the wage gap. And our second wave feminists talked about a huge gap in pay between their male counterparts back in their day. Remember, they're in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. But they were very proud of the hard work they did and the breakthroughs that they accomplished through their activism. Third wave feminists talked about being able to experience equal opportunity and break through in different occupations because of the work that second wave feminists did. But they also report having lower wages and not getting paid as much as their male counterparts. Our fourth wave, women in their 20s, see pay as less of a problem today than it has been, but they also admitted that they don't have a lot of experience in the workforce and they may not be seeing the discrimination that's there. The last theme that was there is the theme of my body, my choice. Second wave, they felt that they fought for the right to an abortion, and they were able to benefit from contraceptives. Third waves actually took the right of abortion and rights over their bodies kind of for granted, that it was something that they grew up with. When they talked about their body, they talked about sexual harassment, specifically catcalling and workplace sexual harassment, as an issue that's important to them. And our fourth wave folks believe that the number one reason to march now in the 21st century is to retain the rights that they have over their body. They are afraid that the right to an abortion and access to contraceptives might go away if conservative folks actually come into political power. And that's why the number one reason that the fourth wave folks hit the streets. So those were the three themes that came out from our study. The importance of gender roles and how gender roles are seen differently between the generations. Wage gap as something that is also seen differently between generations. And also our bodies and our rights to retain control over our own right to an abortion or contraceptives. So those were the three themes that came out. If you ask about, well, what's the difference between the UK and Britain, there were specific nuances, such as those in Britain in the second wave reported not just fighting for women's rights, but fighting for labor rights and going on strike and being leaders in the labor movement. Where in the United States, some of the women talked about from the second wave joining up with civil rights groups and learning strategies from Black civil rights groups specifically. So there were differences in why or how one protested maybe in the second wave, but we found conscious raising groups in both countries at the same time. Women's organizations developing in both countries at the same time. Different groups, same purpose. So we found it very interesting looking back and forth between the two countries, the differences in how each wave achieved their goals, but we didn't find a difference really in the movement or the purpose of the movement. However, we did find, as I pointed out in each of these themes, a difference between generations. So our last question to all the groups was, is there a fourth wave of feminism? And I would assume that everyone would say yes. There's the Me Too movement. And most recently, as this podcast is being created, the governor of New York is being accused of sexual harassment in the workplace. you could pick any period of time in American history, and you could cite different uh, articles and stories in the news, in the media, in the newspaper that report different types of sexual harassment in the United States. And we are not unique, it is all around the world. When we looked at this fourth wave of feminism, I would assume that everyone would say, yes, that's what's going on. That's why the Me Too movement. But we also found a difference in generation. Second wave feminists knew almost nothing about the current movement of feminists. They didn't see or hear. Uh, for the most part, they reported that they're not on social media. And most of the um, third and fourth wave feminists report knowing about current feminist movements via social media. The third wave feminists, we found it interesting, those in their 30s, 40s, 50s, were very interested and grateful to the young fourth wave feminists for teaching them about gender fluidity. And many of them reported that they stay they watch social media, they watch Twitter, they read different tweets, and they learn from the younger generation. The fourth wave feminists talked about call out culture and calling folks out online and activism behind the keyboard. They talked about intersectionalism of races and white privilege. Those folks of color, women of color that were in the study as well, they reported that they were very skeptical. They don't see much change in leadership. They see many white young feminists at the head of the pack, and that they feel that they're discriminated both in the movement and outside of the movement. So that's what we found. And you might say, well, okay, that was a lot of stuff. So what? Who cares? Well, I'm trying to figure out, and I'd be curious to read some of the comments below here. If you're watching this on YouTube, write down in the comments section. If you're watching on or listening on iTunes or another podcast channel, leave some comments there. I wish this was interactive, that I could actually see you right now. Um, the so what is, well, why are folks not saying they're feminists today? What is a feminist? Well, by definition, a feminist is somebody who believes that those who identify as women are whole people, that they're political, they're intelligent, they're emotional, they're philosophical, they're spiritual, they're whole people. They're not genitalia, they're not a body, they're not a half a person, they're not less intelligent. That's what feminism means. It means that you believe in the equality of the sexes. Now, as we see with the fourth wave and the newest generation, they broaden that to be intersectionalistic, to include issues of racism, sexism, altogether transphobia. Um, and maybe that's why there's such pushback today, because it is more than just feminism in its traditional sense of being just women, that in the current movement, it's a social justice movement that includes trans folk, folks of color, etc. Maybe that's one of the reasons, because the definition has broadened, that there are more people that would not define themselves as feminist. We also have the problem, I think, within the feminist community and we saw some of this in Britain when we interviewed second wave feminists, of the issue of TERFs, TERFS, which means trans exclusionary radical feminists. which believe that trans women are not women. And that is an idea that is archaic, not radical at all. Okay, even though they're called radical feminists, um, they are not being inclusive, and they're not recognizing that gender is a construct. It is a construct by which many people are discriminated against. And to include TERFs in a feminist movement is very controversial. And I have seen some signs in the United States at feminist marches uh, from TERFs holding up signs, but I've seen them shout it down and asked to leave different marches because of not radical views, but discriminatory views. So that's another problem. If feminists are stereotyped as TERFs, as folks that are trans exclusionary, that would be a reason why some folks don't want to define them as feminists. And then we have the issue of race. There are some folks of color, women of color, who do not define themselves as feminist. They define themselves as womanist. And part of that definition is a history of discrimination within the feminist movement towards folks of color. So, as you can see, the movement of feminist movement over the past century has been problematic in its exclusionary approach to race and gender identification. So there are some very liberal folks, some very, what we'd say, radical folks that are not defining themselves as feminist because they see it as exclusionary. And there are some very conservative folks who do not believe in equality that are also not defining themselves as feminist. So that leaves us with the question again, where in the world are the feminists? And is feminism dead? Is it done? Because of the discrimination within the movement? Because of its embracing of gender identities and trans issues? Because of its embracing of other social justice issues such as racism? Right? That's where we are today. You know, when I think about this and I think, well, am I a feminist? Dr. Toni Bear, am I a feminist? Um, I believe that women are whole people, intellectually, capable, economically, politically, in every shape, manner, or form. I, however, have never been a member of a feminist group for all of the reasons that I have laid out up to this point. Um, Am I a feminist? Yes. Am I a member of a feminist group? No. Have I gone on marches? Yes. Right? Um, and those nuances and those definitions are important because, you know, for a group to have power, it needs to form a coalition of many different groups to have the numbers and the power of influence. But if some of the principles of the group or some of the representatives of the group are exclusionary of those other groups that could possibly collaborate and become part of a coalition, that's problematic, right? Never been much of a joiner myself. Um, and this is our discussion today on where in the world are feminists. I think feminists, such as myself, are all over the place. I think that there is more of us than what we find in a particular group. However, the future of feminism will, feminist groups will disband. The future of feminism is important because we need equality of the sexes. And some folks do live in the binary. And sometimes folks that live in the binary feel that gender inclusiveness in a movement erases those that live in the binary, right? We fight amongst ourselves. Now, I am very excited that in broadcasts in the future, I have some very young folks coming to talk about their radical views of feminism and other topics. I also have a few individuals coming up shortly on episodes coming up in the next 2 months from different parts of the world. One who is in Kenya, another in India, to talk about their radical ideas for the countries that they're in at this time. And I look forward to sharing that with you. Next week, I have a guest, Susan Calvin, who's going to talk about her transitioning. She was a Vietnam helicopter pilot. She's a vet, and she transitioned after her Army service, and she has a fascinating story of transitioning and a brand new book called Changeling that we're going to talk about next week. Thank you so much for joining the Radical Rhythm podcast today. I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in today to the Radical Rhythm podcast. The Voyagers of Aphrodite is a free Facebook group. If you are female identified and interested in talking about your sexuality and being amongst other women who are also interested in empowering one another, please find it on Facebook or on the link below and join the group. It's free. You might also see that there's another group, the Voyagers of Aphrodite. It's called the Voyagers Club Inner Circle. This group is a paid subscription program, and it's a place where I go in every month and hold seminars based upon the challenges that are being faced amongst the women in the group. This is also a group dedicated to working on their sexuality and specifically bringing joy into their life. And it truly brings me joy to work with them almost on a daily basis within our group. If you're interested, again, there is a link below. Last but not least, if you like the Radical Rhythm podcast, it's free. It's on YouTube and soon to be on Spotify and Apple and SoundCloud. Please click the button below, subscribe, so that you don't miss the next episode.